just giving it a second to make sure that it's streaming. I think we're good. Good afternoon, everybody, to those in the United States and Canada. Good evening to those across the seas in the British Isles. And thank you for joining us on Findmypast Let's Discuss. Very excited to have you with us today. As you can see, we have a guest. Hi, guest.
Hello.
Rich Venezia is joining us. He is an expert on immigration. We're going to introduce him properly in just a second. I'm just going to take a minute and let the feed catch up and make sure that people are with us and watching and paying attention. So please say hi. Let us know where you're at in the world. We love to talk to you and get your questions and your comments. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to really focus on what you want to know about immigration. So say hello as we get started, and I'm kind of going to wait and make sure that people are watching. Hopefully someone's out there in the world. What do you think, Rich? Is there anybody out there?
A few, I think.
A few, maybe. All right. So my name is Jen Baldwin. I'm the data acquisition manager for North America for Findmypast, and one of our in-house genealogy experts. I've been with the company for almost 7 years, which is a little weird to say. I know, I see your face and I'm like, what? So yeah, it's been quite a journey, and we have a really wonderful collection for passenger-less immigration records, finding your ancestor across the pond, right? But our strength as a company is in British and Irish records. So we're here to help you go from North America back into the British Isles. But I think what we're going to mostly talk about today is the flip side of that journey, the other way around. So this should be a really fun conversation. So let me introduce Rich really quick. Rich Venezia is a professional genealogist. He lives in Pittsburgh, where my Irish American ancestors lived. So that's fantastic. He's a leading expert in 20th century immigration research and records, especially underutilized record sources and federal records, which is such a large category of material. We were just talking before we started. He was a member of the PBS Genealogy Roadshow research team for 2 seasons, and he also consulted on Follow Your Past on the Travel Channel. He researches for family histories for private clients, TV shows, attorneys, and other genealogical research firms, and conducts research for those who have Italian and Irish ancestry with annual trips to Europe, which I'm always really jealous of. And I always tell him, if you have spare time, look up my Irish people, and then he never has spare time, and so I still don't have any records from Ireland.
Well, you have to come with me one day, Jen.
I should come with you someday, that is true. All right, so genealogical research certificate from Boston University in 2015. He lectures nationally and spoke about, and you guys have to watch this, how to grow empathy from uncovering your roots at TEDx Pittsburgh in 2017. If you haven't yet seen it, that video is incredible. We actually posted it on the Facebook page, on the Findmypast Facebook page just a couple hours ago. So the link is right above this post. So be sure to take, what is it, 30 minutes or so?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Yeah, okay, it's not very long, but take a few minutes to watch that because it's a really, really powerful message.
I think you mean not long enough.
Possibly not long enough. Yeah, you should do another one. I think that's a good idea. And most recently, you might have seen him coordinating the Records Not Revenue campaign in late 2019 and early 2020, which was hugely successful. And you got an award from that.
I did.
That's exciting.
On my very bare bookshelf.
Take a few minutes to watch that because it's a really, really powerful message. Oh, your volume is up.
Nope. Sorry, I lied. That's my fault.
That's all right. Okay, so hi,
Rich.
Rich.
You told me not to do.
Did we talk about that?
Jen. It's all gone downhill from here.
That's great. So welcome to Let's Discuss.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, absolutely. Rich is one of our Findmypast ambassadors as well. So very excited that he is part of the Findmypast family. We've got a lot of people logging in and saying hi. So thanks very much for that, everybody. Linda, Liz, Shirley, Ivy. I'm expanding my comment screen so I can see more. Lots of wonderful people. Please do let us know where you're from as well, and what your interest is, and what you're researching, and what you're working on right now. This series and these Facebook Lives are all about. My Siri just went off. They're all about you. So we really want to know what you're working on. Glenda from New Zealand. Wow, thanks, Glenda.
Wow.
don't know, I don't remember the time conversion off the top of my head, but it's early in the morning, I think.
Oh.
Donna from Athens, Georgia. Oh, Miko's here. That's great. Miko, for those of you who don't know him, maybe he's one of my colleagues at Findmypast, actually, and a good friend of everybody. William, viewing from England as usual. Thank you, William, for being with us. We appreciate it. All right, so let's jump in. We had a couple of questions early on, that were posted to the page. But Rich, I want to start with just some basics, right? Can you help us with I'm going to ask you a very generic but probably difficult question. If you had to give one piece of advice to someone researching their immigrant ancestor, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, just one?
One thing.
I wish I got this question in advance.
Yeah, well, that's why I don't give it to you in advance.
Well, I guess kind of what we were just talking about. There isn't always a ship manifest, period. End of story. Yeah. You're not always going to find an arrival record. And that, I think, is something that's important for a lot of people to realize, especially folks that have earlier ancestors. Really, the later the immigration, the more likely it is you're going to find a lot more records, whether it's related to naturalization, immigration, alien registration, visas, things like that. But especially early on, and even well into the 1800s, there's a lot of times where you're just not going to find a passenger arrival list. There's a lot of different reasons for this, and we can talk about that now or throughout the hour. But just something that I think is really important for folks to keep in mind. Several of the questions were about, how do I find a passenger arrival, or when do I figure out how my person of interest arrived, and it was the 1820s or the 1850s or the 1870s. And, unfortunately, the answer is sometimes there just isn't going to be an arrival list, whether a ship manifest, a customs list, a passenger list. And as such, you're going to want to start looking into other records here in the States, whether that be tax lists, voter rolls, naturalization records, censuses, things like that, to plant boots on the ground in a certain year at a certain time. But it's just really important, I think, to remember that you aren't always going to find a passenger list. The more recent the immigration, the much likelier it is you're going to be successful in finding a passenger list and determining with certainty that that person is your person of interest.
Right. Great. That's a good starting synopsis. So you did that really well when I put you on the spot. So good. So it's actually, because we mentioned this at the beginning, Glenda came back. It's 8 a.m. on Thursday in New Zealand. So it's not as early as I thought it was. But we also have people watching from Greece, which is fantastic. The Pennsylvania Turnpike rest stop, which I have to assume you're familiar with. That's Jamie. Thanks, Jamie. We've got Mary from North Dakota with Irish immigrants and common surnames. Oh, Mary. Yeah, I feel ya. Irish immigrants and common surnames. Absolutely. All right. So, and a few extra questions coming in. So that's great. And we'll ask, we'll get through those as we go through the hour. So just so everybody knows, if we don't answer your question right away, we're not ignoring you. It's just a matter of scrolling through the list and kind of getting the basics covered. So Rich, you mentioned passenger lists in your one piece of advice, but there's a difference between ship manifests and customs lists.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about why those are different and what we need to know about that?
Sure. So when we're talking right now about American records, right, and records that were created by and for essentially the American government. And so basically, there was no sustained reporting of passengers arriving to the United States until the Steerage Act of 1819, which went into effect at the beginning of 1820. So that means that prior to 1820, it's possible that you're going to find an arrival list for your immigrant ancestors, but it's kind of piecemeal whether that's actually going to happen or not, because there wasn't a federal requirement for that to happen. And as you know, of course, the US was still a relatively new country at that point in the early 1800s. Now, starting in 1820, the lists that were created were actually customs lists. They were created to regulate customs, not to regulate immigrants. They were essentially created, as many things are, as we know as genealogists, for the money, right? They wanted to know essentially how much tax to collect. And what was being brought into the country and who was being brought into the country, but it was less important about the specific person and more important about the number of people. And so that didn't actually change until the late 1800s. The Immigration Act of 1891 federalized immigration, where beforehand it had been handled by different states, and they had different rules about, you know, how they were letting immigrants into the country. And so once the immigration system became a national system, then passenger lists started, and that was around 1892, 1893. So the idea behind that is from 1820 up until the early 1890s, those lists weren't created so genealogists could find their ancestors' arrival 150 years later or 200 years later, and you're trying to sort through all of the Samuel Smiths that arrived that were around the same age as your person. They were created to regulate customs. Now, starting in the 1890s, we have passenger lists, and those were created and furnished to what would become the Bureau of Immigration to regulate immigrants and to regulate immigration. And as such, as years went on, more and more information started being listed on those lists. So it's important to remember that, again, the earlier the immigrant, the less likely it is for there to be a list, and or the less likely there is to be a lot of good information on that list for you to be able to determine with 100% certainty that that Samuel Smith is your Samuel Smith. This changes in the 1890s, and in the early 1900s, there's a lot more columns and things added to passenger manifests, and that's because a lot more immigration laws were getting passed. So they needed to make sure that the immigrants that were coming into the country were doing so legally and weren't in violation of any of the immigration laws that had been passed in terms of becoming a likely public charge, having a contagious disease, things like that.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, so that was a lot of information. So I'm going to give everybody a second to consume that. Your sound is a little bit weird, so I'm going to ask you to put those headphones in that we talked about before we started. While you do that, though, I'm going to contribute a little bit to that concept of early immigration. So Rich is really an expert in 20th century, you know, this more recent period, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to bring him on the series, because we've had a lot of conversations in the last couple of weeks about some of that earlier material. And as any of you know who have watched more than once, I like to recommend books. As someone who has done a pretty decent amount of research in the colonial period, which is generally speaking about 1600 to roughly 1720-ish, 1730 in the United States, there is actually quite a lot written about that period. And it's possible to find very interesting materials, but they're not on genealogy websites. Right, those materials are published by academics and historians. And so one example that I want to share, I've been wanting to share for a couple of weeks actually, is this book called Migration and the Origins of the English Atlantic World. It's a fantastic piece. Have you read this, Rich? I know it's not your period, it's not your era.
I'm going to write it down though.
It's by Alison Games. It's absolutely fantastic. And what she does is, so there was a massive migration out of London in 1635. So she analyzes just that 1 year of global migration out of London in 1635. And it's fascinating, right? It just gives you so much information about that era. Now, it just so happens that my ancestor is, in fact, one of the people that came over in 1635. And so he's mentioned in the book. But I didn't know that when I got it. It was recommended to me by another genealogist we've had on the series, Josh Taylor, during one of his institute classes. And I ordered it while we were sitting in the class and read it immediately. And it's an absolutely fascinating piece of study. So just because it's not on a genealogy website doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You just might have to go a little deeper, right, into some of our other friends in the world of history to find what it is that you're looking for.
Tell us the name one more time, Jen.
Yeah, it's Migration and the Origins of the English Atlantic World by Alison Games.
Lovely.
And
Thank you.
I will post a link after we're done with the live feed. So that everybody has access to it. So those are not affiliate links, by the way. I just happen to share from Amazon because it's the most universal source. But find it anywhere, right? Libraries have it. It's, you know, pretty well respected piece of work. So, or your favorite bookseller. All right, so let's get back to more recent eras, because I could talk all day about colonial stuff, but that's not what we're here
And
for.
I would let you because I don't know very much about it.
Right? Okay, so you in one of your areas of specialties is these kind of underutilized record sets.
Yeah.
Tell us, give us an example of something that you would call an underutilized record set.
Oh my gosh. There are tons of different records that relate to immigrants at the regional branches of the National Archives all across the country. I've been lucky enough to go to maybe 5 or 6 of them. And every time that I'm there, I try to look at the records there that are in record group 85, which is the record group related to the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And each regional branch sometimes hold different pieces of the same record series, but a lot of times they might hold one-offs, something for a state that exists for one state that doesn't exist anywhere else and kind of survived as a matter of happenstance. I spent some good time at the National Archives at Philadelphia back in October, and a ton of records from the Port of Philadelphia still survive. Now, people ask all the time, oh, do the port records from Ellis Island survive? And aside from the ship manifests, a lot of the stuff that happened at Ellis Island, all those records were destroyed because they were temporary. But it happens that the Port of Philadelphia, the records from the late 1800s and early 1900s, inspector notebooks, the outgoing ship manifests, all these different things about local boards of charities helping, poor immigrants immigrating to the country and things like that. All these records that did exist at some point for other ports, but no longer exist. We get a really interesting look into them by looking at the Philadelphia port records. And so I love spending time there. And there's different little gems like this at archives all over the country.
Great. So one of the questions that, of course, we get all the time, and I'm sure you get a lot as well, right, is the passenger list question. But there are some unique sources that we can utilize, right? So on Findmypast, we have a collection called, I actually have to look at it and make sure I get it right, Passenger List Leaving the UK from 1890 to 1960. And it's a fantastic record set, but tell us in your opinion why it's special. What makes it different than other sources?
So one of the great things about the passenger list leaving the UK is that, first of all, it's not just to the US. And so you can find, if you're researching English ancestors or siblings of your English ancestors, you can find them going all over the place, not just to New York, for instance. But also it's a great opportunity to get a second look at, or a different look at the same journey, right? Because if you're looking for somebody that's going to the United States, that's going to New York, for instance, you should be able to get both the UK departure list and the US arrival list. And sometimes the information on them is actually different. It shouldn't be, it's the same person, right? But it's a really interesting way to kind of piece a story together. You can also think about how long the journey took, what it was like for them, dig into information on the people, that they were on the ship with. But also, it might be a good opportunity for you to glean additional information or find contradictory information. And now you have a conflict that you have to resolve. Were they 15 or were they actually 20, as it says on one list versus the other list, or something like that. And so it's a really great resource, and also goes into 1960, which is well past when a lot of the the ship manifests as we know them exists for the US. Those kind of peter out around the late 40s and early 50s. And so you also get an opportunity to see UK departure lists a little longer than we might have arrival lists for in some ports.
Yeah, and I would note too that, even if your ancestor didn't originate in the UK, it's very likely that they went through the UK, or, I always explain it like in modern terms, right? Today we get on an airplane and we have a layover somewhere. Essentially, the UK was the layover for a lot of Europe. Liverpool was one of the busiest ports ever in like the history of ports, right? And so, and as a result, then you have a lot of people who are coming from Germany or anywhere really on the continent. that are coming through the UK, and thus as a result are part of this passenger list series.
Yeah.
My own ancestors are Germans from Russia, so they're coming from Russia, and they leave a port off the Black Sea and they go over to the UK and then get on a boat and come into Canada. So they're on that collection, even though they're not at all British or anything close to it, right? So it's a great bridge resource, I think, to get you from kind of North America back over to that side of the Atlantic, and then to expand that search, back into Europe.
Absolutely.
I was going to segue that into something else, and for a second I forgot what it was, but now I've remembered. So, in a year, a little bit, no, 2 years, sorry, 2022, we'll be launching the 1921 UK Census.
Woohoo!
Which we are so excited about. And I have been thinking about this a lot.
And that was a Findmypast exclusive.
Oh, well done, Rich.
He isn't paying me to say this. I just know.
I'm not. It is actually. So, we're really excited about it, right? Obviously, it's a big collection. It's one of the largest genealogy sources for England and Wales ever created, something of that nature. So I've been thinking about this, and I get asked a lot, what impact will this have in the United States? And my thought is that potentially we'll find some clues in that 1921 census for these later immigrants. So Rich, what do you think about the 1921 census? What do you think you're going to use it for as an American genealogist?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot of potential uses for it. I personally do have late 1800s immigrants from England and Wales, from Staffordshire. And so I'm really interested to see what the census says for me and my family in terms of the siblings that didn't immigrate. But also, as you touched on, since the UK was kind of a stopping point for a lot of people, there's the potential to find folks that were en route from one place to another and perhaps were stopping in England for more than just a couple of days on their way somewhere else, whether that be the US or Canada or South America or elsewhere, right? And this is also the time frame that US immigration law starts to get really restrictive. So folks might have heard of the quota system that was enacted in the 1920s. And so that first came into play in 1921 and then was further restricted in 1924. And what that did is it limited the amount of immigrants from certain countries that could enter the US any given year. They had to essentially get a visa from the consulate in the country that they were traveling from, and only X amount of visas were granted per year. We could talk about that for ages and ages and ages, but basically it could be that your family gets stopped in England for a while because you can't get a visa, or it takes a couple of years to get a visa, or perhaps somebody in the family is elderly or sick and there's concern about whether they'll get admitted to the US. And so they stick around in the UK for a while to see whether that person gets better, or to figure out what they're going to do, whether half the family is going to immigrate or something like that. And so because those timeframes coincide, I'd be really interested to see what the number of kind of temporary residents or immigrants to the UK that didn't necessarily intend to make the UK their permanent home are going to be found in that census.
Yeah, so interesting comment from Roseanne, actually. She says, my relatives stopped in the UK for several years between coming from Lithuania and leaving to the US,
Indeed.
according to her mother. So yeah, absolutely. And I think I actually am suspicious that my own family, those Germans from Russia, did the same thing.
Yeah.
They were, if the timeline is right, they were there for at least 9 months. And it just happens to be over the time when the 1921 census was taken. Oh, good. My ancestors finally did something for me. All right, so let's get to a couple of these questions.
Great.
And I think that some of these will really model kind of what you've been talking about already in the idea of record accessibility and strategy and that kind of thing. So Lindsay had asked earlier, her 3 times great-grandfather left London for the United States in 1869. Why is there no record at Castle Garden?
Indeed. So this goes back to this idea of that there isn't going to be a ship manifest, or in this time frame, a customs list for every person that comes into the US. There's a lot of reasons for this. We could write books and books and books and books and books about all the things that we don't know about this time frame and the types of records that could have been or should have been created. I can't find passenger lists for my English great three times great grandparents in the 1870s. And I know they were there in 1871 because they're on the census in Scotland before they leave. And then I know they're in New York in 1874 because my great great grandfather was born in New York City. And I can't find a passenger list for them. These folks were of some status. I know that they worked in the potteries up in Stoke-upon-Trent. And so it's possible they traveled second or even first class. And there's conjecture over whether folks in first and second class were listed on some of these lists. We know that a lot of times people should have been, but whether they were or not is a different story. And so it might just be that there isn't a list for that person. I'd say really the best bet that you can do is try and find a later naturalization record. Starting in the early 1900s, naturalization records do usually give a ship of arrival and a date and port of arrival. Sometimes things like that are listed on earlier naturalization records, but that becomes standard in 1906. So for an 1869 arrival, it could just be that there isn't a list and you're not going to find one. And I'd say your research time might be better spent elsewhere.
Yeah, naturalization records are really crucial, right? And we can
Indeed.
get clues to that just through the U.S. Census. And certain years of the U.S. Census record whether they were naturalized or they were still an alien. So go
Indeed.
back to what you know, review the documents you already have on hand, look at those census records and look at every column and make sure that you know what their citizenship status was.
Yeah.
So you know which route to take in your research, right?
And also remember that all records lie, right?
Yeah, totally. Right. Yeah,
people
absolutely.
usually didn't claim to be an alien if they were naturalized, but a lot of times people that maybe had started the process but hadn't finished thought they might have been citizens already or something like that. So use the census records to try and whittle down a time frame, but of course take them with a bit of a grain of salt.
Yeah. Okay, good. So,
oh, and there's also a great,
go ahead.
Roseanne had a great comment here about first and second class passengers may be listed in a newspaper.
Ah, yeah.
So true, right? So this is, thank you, Roseanne, so much. So this is a perfect time frame where a lot of times, essentially what we would think of as what the information we want on a passenger list is sometimes listed in newspapers. So definitely check out historical newspapers for the area in New York, in northern New Jersey, Connecticut, things like that, especially for New York, to see if they list who was arriving on those ships. Because it could be there's a passenger list of sorts in the newspaper that doesn't actually exist anymore, or that there wasn't one of a customs list.
And also check the British version of the newspaper to see when the ship actually left port and how long that voyage lasted and the conditions and all those things. Like I have this snippet that tells me which tugboat pulled my Irish ancestors out into the ocean, like away from Liverpool. And I love it, right? It doesn't list their names, but that's cool, right? That's just a cool thing to have. Yeah.
It just adds such great context to the family story.
I was looking at it earlier actually, and for something I'm doing next week, and it was a fresh breeze to the northeast. And every time I read that, I just, I
love it.
It's so like Titanic a little bit, but it's like, like, oh, what a great moment.
Yeah.
I picture my ancestor like out on the bow. I know it wasn't, but I do it anyway.
Very Titanic of them, right?
Very Titanic of them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. So let's see. So I'm still scrolling through questions. Can you hear the pounding, by the way, on the ceiling? Do you hear any noise? Okay, great. My daughter is practicing her baton twirling and she's dropping it once in a while right above my head. I love it. I love it. It means she's working hard. Okay, so Grace wants to know about ships. Her ancestors came from Windsor, Ontario, traveled to Pennsylvania from Scotland around 1888. How would she find the ship that they actually came over? Do you have suggestions, Rich, on
Can you read that to me one more time, please?
Yeah, sure. If I can find it again. Every time it drops,
they went from Scotland to Windsor to Pennsylvania, or
I think so.
Scotland to Pennsylvania.
That's what it reads like. But I think the question generally is just how do you find ships? Like how would you information about ships? How would you know what ship they would be on? And it's 1888.
So this is another I'm sorry, I'm all confused about like the passenger list as opposed to the ship itself, right?
I
We're
think
not
she wants
interested
to
in the
know.
ship. We're
She
interested
wants
in
to
the
know what
passenger list.
ship they were on. How would she find out
I
what ship
see.
they were on? That's the question.
So,
Oh, no pounding
well,
sound. Thanks, Nancy.
there's a couple of issues with that in terms of Canadian, if they went from Scotland to Canada to the US, which was like a big route, the British Isles to Canada prior to coming to the US, there weren't Canadian border arrival lists or records made until later in the 1800s. I think it started around 1895, and the people that were listed on those early records are differ. Like it's not every single person that came from Canada to the US.
Right.
And
Okay. So
so,
sorry, I reread
yes.
it. And I think she's just saying she's in Windsor, Ontario. Grandparents traveled to Pennsylvania from Scotland.
In the 1880s.
Yes.
Okay. So all of what I said still holds, except
Yeah.
not for you specifically.
Yeah. Exactly.
So this is again around that time frame that it could be that there isn't a passenger list. As we're getting into the 1880s, there should be a record of that arrival. Unfortunately, it's a couple years too early for the outbound UK lists, but for inbound US lists, Jen had mentioned there's a couple of really good resources on Findmypast that you could look into. There's of course lots of different indexes on different websites. Family Search has some, Ellis Island has some. And so utilize all the resources at your disposal in terms of trying to find a record, because it could be that people indexed the records differently, and it could be that the index on Family Search is different than the index on Findmypast, is different than the index on Ellis Island. So you might be trying to find the same record, all of which should be on all of those websites, but it could be that the indexing that was done was different. And so where you might find it in one place, you might not find it in another place, or vice versa. So I'd say look for that arrival in a bunch of different places to see if maybe you have a better luck in one database over another.
There's also a couple of good websites about ships in particular. And I'm Googling to see if I can find them. I'm pretty sure that one is the ship index, ships index, sorry, it's plural. And as I find them, I will share the links. Yep, so a vessel research database, ship index. It's a guy up in New York. I think he works at Cornell, if I remember right, from meeting him a few years ago, that started this list. It's a really interesting project. And he's tried to kind of go through all these academic historic resources and identify all the ships themselves that were involved in this mass human transit, right, of immigration. So I'm sharing that one to the post on the page. So for Grace, take a look at that site, and maybe that's a starting point for you to give you some ideas about how you might otherwise identify the ship itself. Okay, so a couple other questions. Let me go back to my list. I have to have the list.
They're really flying by. It's hard to.
It goes really fast, right? So this is why I like the questions that are asked in advance, because I can think about them for a minute. Okay, so there was a great question earlier from Paul. Paul Donner says, my great-great-grandmother, Emma Louise Smith, I know you're excited about this one. Emma Louise Smith suddenly appears in New York. The only way I knew this was that her 8-year-old daughter was met by her in New York when she traveled, apparently unchaperoned at the age of 8, from Southampton on the SS Teutonic. The date was 27 April 1910. The daughter, Doris, is born in Middlesex, but it seems sometime after that her parents must have split, as he went to Coventry with the sons. I want to try and find out when Emma went to New York and when and if they came back. Any thoughts would be welcome.
So this was left earlier in the day, so I did a bit of peeking into this, and I find this story really interesting, Paul. I found the manifest that you're talking about, which was a bit tough in the first place. The original post didn't have the date of arrival, and there's a surprising amount of Doris Smiths who traveled at a young age in the early 1900s. But this is a great example of making sure to look at the image as well as the transcript. And so the transcript is available on Findmypast. and I was able to look at the image as well. I found the image on Family Search. It could be that for some reason, I don't know, that image didn't make it onto Findmypast, or I just didn't do hard enough searching, either one. But it's a great example of the actual image holding a ton more information that's very helpful to you. And so it tells us about the, it tells us that she was leaving behind her uncle, which I think is really interesting. It doesn't list her father or any of the siblings that she left behind. It tells us that she left behind this uncle. And I'm trying to load it here to see if I can get it up for you. And it gives you an exact address of where she's going to her mother in the US. It actually listed originally that her mother was living in New York City, but then that it was crossed out, and then a new address in Yonkers, New York was listed. So I'm pulling up this list here. And so Doris is leaving behind her uncle in Luton, it looks like, F. Hayden at 99 Ashton Road in Luton. It looks like Bedfordshire, but I could be wrong. And then she's going to her mom in Yonkers. And the great news is that Westchester County has a ton of records available online. There are a ton of indexes, at least. They have a great archives, and marriage licenses, naturalization indexes, all these types of records are indexed online. So what I would do if I were you is take a peek into those resources available through the Westchester County archives. See if you find a naturalization record for Doris or for her mother. See if you find a subsequent marriage record for her mother. I don't know if they have divorce indexes, but certainly check for the divorce indexes, because she should have divorced before she got remarried, right? Should have. And then also check for the same about Doris. See if she got married. See if she naturalized. One other thing that I wanted to note about the manifest, when you look at the image, there's actually an annotation listed on the manifest that was added after the fact. And so starting in the 1920s, in the Bureau, what became the INS, what became Immigration and Naturalization Service, started to annotate ship manifests when people naturalized because they needed to prove their lawful arrival into the country, or if they were leaving the country and wanted to come back, they had to, and they weren't a citizen yet, they had to apply for what's called a re-entry permit. And when we look at Doris's record, it lists a 6-digit number and the date 1/1931 on this manifest. There's a couple of different places you can look, but the best place is a website called Manifest Markings. And that tells you about all the different types of annotations that were later made to ship manifests. So what I theorize about this Doris is that she came to the US, and in 1931, looks like she applied for a re-entry permit, which first of all meant that she was not a citizen yet. And second of all, meant that she went probably back to England in 1931. Now, we don't have departure lists for that time frame, but it seems like she may have gone back for a visit. So A, we want to figure out if she got married, so we can figure out what her married name is to hopefully find the return list from when she came back in 1931, 1932. Or if she came back, because if she went back to England and stayed, but had since married, we're not going to find her under the name Doris Smith. We're going to find her under a different name. So there's a bunch of different things that I think you can do in this situation, and researching Doris in Westchester County will therefore help you research the mother in Westchester County. When you're looking at super common names like Smith, right? You want to cast as wide a net as possible. And since Doris is a bit of an uncommon name, we want to look both into Doris as well as the mother, Emma Louise Smith, to see if they show up in any of these indexes, marriages, naturalizations, or also on the 1915 New York State Census, just to name a few.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you use the expression cast the net while we're talking about immigration. I just think it's appropriate. So for that story in particular, we shared the links to all the records that Rich was able to locate earlier. All the links are on the post. So for Paul, he, Rich did a little bit of the research for you today.
Well, keep us posted. I'm invested in this now. I want to know what happened.
Right? Yeah.
I'm assuming it's his, like, this Doris is seemingly his great grandfather's sister, you know, because otherwise he probably would have known what happened to her if it was his direct ancestor, I think. Anyway, maybe, I don't know.
Right.
So yeah, keep us posted if you find some other
Yeah,
stuff.
Paul, let us know. Let us know what happens with that.
On the comments.
I also posted the link to the Manifest Markings site that Rich
it's a
mentioned.
wonderful
So
website. Yeah.
I didn't know about that one, so I'm
Oh my
excited. I'll
gosh,
dig
it's
in.
great. Keep in mind, it doesn't say this specifically. It's hopefully going to be updated soon, but it does really specifically apply to New York City
Okay.
lists, because
Got
different ports had slightly different annotations.
ways
They're
of doing
all
things.
roughly the same,
Yeah.
but just keep that in mind, that if you're like, oh, I've got a San Francisco arrival, the manifest markings on that passenger list may be similar, but may not follow these rules exactly.
Exactly. Okay, good to know. Yep, perfect. So Fiona asked an interesting question that I don't know that I've ever thought about this before. So Fiona wants to know, at what point did air travel become more available to people to travel? And are there flight manifests or similar records for the earlier days in air transport, or was it just simply for the elite or the wealthy?
So it was around the 40s and 50s that air travel became a bit more common. I can't say, frankly, with certainty kind of what year it became accessible to the masses, but I can tell you that, you know, I've researched some immigrants that were not of status that immigrated on ships in the mid 50s, and also some immigrants that came in the early 50s and late 50s, perhaps maybe had a little bit more money, that did arrive on planes. I know I researched an 89-year-old that came over on a boat in 1954, which is just unbelievable to me.
Wow, really?
But yeah, so it wasn't necessarily just for the upper classes. Some manifests for those do exist. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is, you know, why were these records created, right? And as I mentioned, that from 1820 to 1891, these records were customs lists. Then they became passenger lists. And starting in 1924, the official record of arrival for an immigrant was not a passenger list. It was actually their visa. And the visas are kept by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. For the first 20 years, they're with the genealogy program known as the visa files. And I think Linda had asked about this. And then after 1944, they're filed in a different file series. So we don't always have manifests that span all of the years that we want them to span, simply because even if they had existed, they may have been decided at some point that they were not important enough to keep, or they could exist at, for instance, I know the National Archives has a bunch of manifests from, I believe, the 50s up to the 80s, but that haven't been processed because the information on them is so minimal. It almost goes back to the early 1800s customs lists with the lack of information that's on there, because these records were not the official records of arrival for people. So we did not have who the immigrant was going to join, what their visa number was, all these kind of things that we start to see in the late 1800s and early 1900s, because those lists were not created to be someone's official record of arrival. They were created essentially to make sure they had the proper head count, you know, on that airplane, for instance. And so there are a bunch of airplane manifests that do exist from the 40s up into the 60s, if not later on. They're on several of the big, you know, databases. They're probably included here in some of the passenger and crew lists on the Findmypast site. I'm looking specifically to see if it has any on here. But yeah, they do exist. There are big chunks of years that are missing, especially for New York, the late 40s and early 50s. But again, if you're hoping to find somebody that immigrated much later, say in the 40s or the 50s, you're going to want to get in touch with USCIS to see what types of visa records or alien files they have for these individuals, and really shouldn't be too concerned about finding that air manifest per se, because you're going to find a lot more good information elsewhere. And in fact, better information than you would have found on that list in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Good. So you mentioned the passenger and crew list on Findmypast. I posted that, but I'm also going to post a link that I think is really important for that data set. It's the full list of sources that make up that larger collection. So you can really drill down into the details of that collection and actually see what's in there and what's not. So take a look at both of those links in conjunction. Now, Paul did comment back. He said, wow, Rich, thank you. More info than I could have hoped for. So that's good.
Keep us posted.
Yeah, definitely keep us posted. Okay, so all right, so we haven't talked much, and I know there's been a bunch of questions about Ireland, right? And combining your expertise in immigration and Irish records. Rich, give us the lowdown on just immigration from out of Ireland.
It's hard.
Yes, it is.
So, it's really funny. My second great grandfather was born in Ireland, and I've lived in Ireland a couple times. I studied there. I lived in Dublin for a while. And for a while, I was like, man, Irish research is just so easy. I knew where my great great grandfather was from. His World War I and his World War II draft cards said exact place of origin. I was like,
oh my gosh,
I don't know what these people are talking about. That Irish research is hard, right? And then I started researching for other people, and I said, oh, I got really lucky. We also immigrated in the late 1800s. And of course, there's a huge wave of Irish immigration kind of since the beginning of the country, but especially around the time of the famine. And as we've talked about, a lot of the immigration records into the US at that time aren't super helpful. So whether we're talking about passenger lists or customs lists at that time frame, or naturalization records or other immigration related records, a lot of times you're just not going to find good details about, your Bernard Mahan, and making sure that, your person of interest is the same one that you find, right? Something that compounds the problem, as we know, is that a lot of Irish records no longer exist, right? So we're missing the census essentially up until 1901. There's some fragments from 1821 to 1851, but whether they exist or not it's few and far between. If you're researching Catholics from Ireland, the records for the churches might not start until the 1830s, 40s, 50s, perhaps after they left. And so researching Irish immigrants is hard. And even if you find or theorize a place of origin, it sometimes can be really difficult to confirm that back in Irish records, because records from that place in that time frame may simply not exist. Now, that being said, this is when we really want to put on our good genealogist thinking cap and research all the people around our people of interest, right? And so, if you're researching your family and they, settle next to 3 other Irish families, and they all have the same surname, or the death records seem to suggest that the mother's names were the same, or maybe they could be cousins or something like that, you want to branch out and make sure that you're researching all of the records for all of those families and see if you might be able to connect them. Because if you're researching 5 families and there's 12 people in each family, it is the last person of the last family that is going to get the information that you want, whether it be the church baptism finally says a place of origin, or the naturalization was in a time frame that there's good information on those types of records. So you really want to make sure, I hear people say sometimes, well, I'm only interested in my direct line, right? I don't really care about the siblings. And I get that. Once we get back a few generations, it becomes unwieldy, and that's totally understandable. But sometimes, or if not a lot of times, researching the siblings or the cousins or the extended family is so necessary, because that's where you get the information. If you know those people are related and you find the place of origin for the cousin's family, you've likely found a place of origin for your family. But if you've discarded all of the siblings or all of the extended family, you're going to keep hitting the same brick wall, because the records might not exist that you want for your people of interest. But if you extend to the collateral lines, you might then find the information that you're looking for. It takes a lot of work. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of spreadsheets.
Yeah.
But it's totally worth it, especially for those early Irish immigrants.
Yep. And I know Rich has already said it, but I'm going to say it again. That comprehensive, kind of extensive research across the family tree, not just up and down the tree, is so important. So spend your time with what you know already. Spend your time here in North America, right? Do your research thoroughly in North America before you ever try to branch back to Ireland.
100%.
And there's a couple of videos that we've done. Brian Donovan did a video a couple of weeks ago. It's on our Facebook page, and I think it's on YouTube now, about, you know, a little bit more in detail on Irish questions. Yeah. But, you know, again, just to reiterate what we've been saying, for those of you who are asking about passenger lists and immigration records coming over, especially during the time of the Irish famine, they just don't exist. That there were no passenger records during that period for the most part. So,
well, and actually, I've got a couple of books too that I want to recommend. So let me go
grab
them.
Those. And while you do, no, go ahead. It's all right. Go ahead, do your thing. Okay. I'm going to throw my book out there too. There's one in particular about New York City, because I think New York City is complicated. Finding Your Irish Ancestors in New York City by Joseph Buggy is a good book.
Great book.
Yeah, it's a really good book. I hope this wasn't one of the ones that you were going to recommend and I just stole your thunder. Okay, so this one, if you don't have this book and you're looking at Irish ancestry in North America, I highly recommend it. This is one of those books that's very specific, right? I mean, it's in the title, it says New York City, but it will give you ideas about how to research your Irish immigrant no matter where they settled, especially in metropolitan areas. So if you have Irish, you need a copy of this book.
100%. Yeah, I totally agree. I also wanted to mention another New York City-based book, Voices of the Irish Immigrant.
Yes.
It's by the NYGNB.
Yeah, I was gonna pull that one off my shelf.
Oh yeah, so it's like there are these information wanted ads essentially, and there's not just this book. There's a couple of other books or online databases. One is through Boston University.
Yeah, we actually have it on Findmypast.
Fabulous. If you could link to that. It's people that came to the US and had lost track of their siblings would say like, I'm so-and-so from whatever little town in County Down, and I'm looking for my brother or my cousin or my mom, right?
Right. Last seen headed towards, you know, South Dakota. And
so you might didn't even know existed, but a lot of times it will also give a more exact place of origin in Ireland, which is really what you're looking for.
Yeah.
I also want to recommend a lot of Brian Mitchell's books. Right here, I've got Irish passenger lists from 1847 to 71 and Irish immigration lists from 1833 to 1839. We're running low on time, so I don't have too much time to talk about them, but just keep Brian Mitchell in mind. He's got a ton of really good books. These are both instances of transcriptions of records that exist that don't exist for the entirety of Ireland, and they don't exist for every shipping company, and they don't exist for every town. But these are really great reference books to have, and you never know if you're going to find your people of interest in these, and especially if you're doing research on more than one Irish family. I highly recommend these books as well as a lot of Brian Mitchell stuff. John Grenham's book about Irish research as well is the Irish Research Bible. So there's a ton of really, really good Irish research material.
And, you know, if you don't have the budget per se to buy all these books, right, go onto a group like the Findmypast forum and ask if anybody has a copy, right? Ask if they can do a quick lookup in the index. Maybe you want to know a little bit more about the book before you actually make a purchase, or you try and find it in a library. So, you know, take advantage of the Findmypast forum community and lean on each other for that kind of assistance, because not everybody can afford all the books in the world that they want. I have a very generous family who appreciates that I buy books used. So I buy whatever I want. Which is unfair, but that's okay. Not to me. All right. So we've talked about, let's see, is there any major points that we've missed? We've talked about passenger list, manifest. We've talked about air transport. We've talked about kind of the history of law almost across the US. Yeah. I know there's a lot more comments, and we'll try and answer some of those in writing too after we're done.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to make sure that, there was one other thing that I wanted to make sure everybody knew about. So we have talked a couple of times actually about the passenger lists leaving the UK record set. There's an incredible, so that data is very precise, right? It's a very precise time frame, and it's a very interesting record set. As Rich indicated earlier, right? It's more than just coming to the United States. It's kind of global traffic leaving the UK. So Findmypast actually took that data set last year and made it into an infographic, and it's really cool. So there's a blog post that goes with it, and then the infographic itself. I'm going to share both on the chat. But if you get a chance, if you're a visual person at all, like I am definitely a visual person, I love to learn visually, take a look at this infographic because it really does just put the numbers and the massive waves of people kind of into perspective. It's a really, really cool and really well done infographic. And of course I'm biased, right? But but Alex, who does our Find My Past Friday sessions, who many of you know, would really appreciate it if you would take a look at it because he worked really hard on this infographic. And
it's really a great graph.
Yeah, it's really cool. So I just posted the link in the comments. It's a PDF, and then there's a blog post that goes along with it, and it's just a really fascinating way to look at the data.
Yeah, I think so too. I wish we could have that for all sorts of things.
Oh yeah, I know, right? I keep bugging them. You need to make more of these. These are cool. All right. So then I know there was a couple of mentions just really quickly. We've got about 5 minutes left. There was at least a couple of comments, and I don't know that they were questions per se, but I did see a couple of comments about shipwrecks. And I think that's a really interesting angle to pursue as well, right? So I would imagine that a lot of that happens in newspaper research and that kind of thing. And that's how you might get to know come across the idea that your ancestor might have been involved in a shipwreck. But Rich, do you have any commentary on shipwrecks during this period?
I know very little about shipwrecks. I would love to wax poetic about them, but
you can't.
I mean, the one thing that I can tell you is that, contrary to popular belief, ship manifests were not created at the port of arrival, but at the port of departure. So with shipwrecks, sometimes the ship manifest went down with the ship.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so
right.
that's something that's really interesting to consider. You know, like people have pieced together, for instance, the ship manifest of the Titanic, helped by the fact that we have the outbound UK list, but there was some other stops along the way before they wrecked as well. And so, you know, I know, for instance, that that's something that people have talked about in terms of shipwrecks, that, you know, we didn't have the arrival list that should have told us all the people, you know, that were on the ship or that would have gotten off at some of the intervening ports.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's you know, it's another angle of that record destruction that unfortunately plagues us all, right?
Indeed,
But it is, you know, absolutely a possibility that if you think there should be some kind of manifest, maybe it literally is at the bottom of the ocean somewhere.
Long gone by now.
Yeah, right. So I know of one record set that's available. I have not looked for this specifically. I just know about it because that's my job. But there is an index for the shipwrecked passengers to America, 1817 to 1875. It's on Find My Past, of course. And I just shared the link. It's actually provided by our partners at the New York Genealogical Biographical Society. So they published a book about this some time ago, and then they pulled the index and created that as a searchable database. So it's a really interesting perspective and an interesting way to kind of examine the idea of migration and passengers.
Somebody also had a good question about if somebody died on board.
I was just going to say that one. Okay, go for it. Yeah.
So if someone died on board, it was supposed to be recorded. I have found instances where the family story swears that this person died on board and it's not listed on the manifest. But I've seen enough manifests that note that somebody died on board for me to think that it was certainly the practice that it should have been noted on the manifest. That person was more than likely buried at sea, as opposed to, you know, taking the body with them to wherever the port of arrival was. But something to keep in mind as well is that starting in the late 1800s, if people are coming through Ellis Island, if they're coming through New York, they're coming through Ellis Island, there was a hospital there. And so it could have been, and I've seen instances where folks die quickly upon arrival at the hospital from, I mean, all sorts of things. And so that is actually a New York City death record, as opposed to a death record from the ship, even if it happened like 2 hours after they got off the boat, because that's where those records were kept. So something else to keep in mind too, that if you don't note on the manifest that the person died, or the customs list of the person died, there may yet be a record in the port of arrival if they died shortly thereafter. And it just could have been lumped in with the family story. Oh, well, they died on the voyage. Maybe they died on the voyage to their final destination, but perhaps not on the ship itself.
Right. The other, I happened to get lucky enough to find a newspaper clipping about one of my ancestors who came over, and it was published in the New York Times as, you know, the vessel just kind of arriving. But it also gave this wonderful description of 4 people died on the voyage and 1 baby was born. And then it tells about how, like, one of the people that died was actually a crew member, and
Oh, wow.
it's a little bit tragic, right? But it describes how that particular individual died.
Yeah.
Again, doesn't mention my ancestor, but by just by looking at the ship versus my person, I was able to, see like a little bit of what their journey was like. So
Exactly.
don't overlook those social history resources, right? Newspapers, periodicals,
100%.
articles from a variety of different disciplines, right? Use JSTOR, use Percy, all those resources that we've talked about on this series. And if you don't know what those acronyms mean, you got to watch all our videos and catch up. But take a look at all of those aspects of history to try and kind of complete the story.
Yes.
And that brings us directly to the top of the hour. So I hope that everybody has enjoyed this. Rich, it's been a ton of fun. Thank you so much for being
sometime,
on with us.
Please. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. Let's do it again. I know there were a lot of questions that did not get directly addressed. Hopefully the kind of the background information that we tried to offer at the beginning was helpful to everybody, because that's good context to have, right? And I know that there was, some specific, like my ancestor came over in 1822. If we didn't answer your question directly, we'll try to get to those in the comments afterwards. But keep in mind everything that we've talked about in terms of which records existed and what didn't, and really work to refine your research strategy, right? If you're just thinking, oh, I'm just going to find my person who went to America and I'm going to immediately find a passenger list, rethink that a little bit, build a research strategy so you can actually understand what's available and what's not.
It's all about the time frame with these types of records, about what exists, what the records say, what records might not exist anymore, what records never exist in the first place. It's all about the time frame. And the more recent the arrival, the more likely it is you're going to find a lot more records.
And someday you're going to write that book that tells us exactly all those things, right?
One day.
One day. All right. So let's just really quickly before we go, talk about what's coming up for the rest of the week and looking at next week a little bit. So tomorrow, Ellie will be on at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, which is 4 p.m. BST. I know that off the top of my head now. She's going to be talking about house and street history with a special guest from the show A House Through Time in the UK, which is going to be really exciting. So if you're interested in house research, house history, or if you're a fan of the show, tune in for that conversation tomorrow. And then, of course, Alex will be back on Friday with our Find My Past Fridays. Then next week, I have a big week next week. I'm excited. On Tuesday, I know I'm really these are 2 that I'm really looking forward to. On Tuesday at 9 a.m. Mountain, 4 p.m. BST, I'm going to be talking about the Canadian photographic collection from World War II that we just published for the 75th anniversary of VE Day. And it's a really, really cool record set. Like, these photos are amazing. So watch that one. If you have any interest in Canada or World War II history, you're going to want to see this. And then on Wednesday for our Let's Discuss series, no guest next week. I'm actually going to ask the community to help me with my current research project. I'm going to present to you what I'm working on. It happens to be based in Birmingham, England. I'm going to give you what I know so far, and we are going to crowdsource things I've missed, what I should do next, my opportunity for research. I strongly believe in the power of the community. I believe everybody has something to teach everyone. So next Wednesday is all about hands-on research and what I can learn from all of you. So that's what's coming up next week. It's going to be fun. Rich, you should tune in and you should watch and you should tell me all the things I've done wrong.
I should start now.
Yeah, I'll send it to you early. All right, so that's it for us today. To all of you out there, thank you for being a part of our Find My Past family. Take care of yourselves. Be safe.
Yes.
Thank you, Rich, again for being with us. And we will see you back on the Find My Past Facebook page tomorrow with Ellie. Have a great day, everybody.